Hi, this is Crystal Veroni. I'm coming to you today from the Toronto airport because I've been trapped here instead of being able to make it. Um, but I'm going to try to record my talk so I can share my research with you. I'm really excited to join you. I will be joining the conference as soon as I can get in. And I'm going to share my research that I've been doing. This paper is titled 18th Century Medical Texts and Sara Coleridge, a Case Study. So this is an image here of Sara Coleridge. It's a lithograph, and I chose it because it really depicts her during the time that she would have been a mother. So the mid-18th century witnessed a proliferation of medical manuals on reproductive and infant care that appeared to anticipate the sweeping changes in the regulation of medicine that would, along with specialization and professionalization, radically alter medicine as a field of practice in Britain 100 years later. Historians of medicine and science, such as Helen King, Ornella Muscucci, and Londa Scheibinger, have done much to situate medical manuals on reproductive care within the context of the recovery of texts of antiquity, the decline of practices of midwifery, and the emergence of a new branch of empirical medicine that focused solely on women. Despite the excellent work already being done, a gap exists in our understanding of how medical manuals influenced women writers in the early to mid 19th century. This period of time deserves closer attention because it marks the organizational development of gynecology in Britain, as well as new emerging medical discourses related to the rise of empirical medicine. So the research I present today is part of a project that aims to nudge out British women writers' perspectives on the rise of empirical medicine and the ways that this influenced their literary writing. Since the scope of this project is too broad to address comprehensively in this brief presentation, I'm going to limit it to just Sara Coleridge's writing as a case study of women's responses to the changes in medicine and their contribution to women's views about these changes. And of course, this is an ongoing project, and I would greatly appreciate any feedback or suggestions for reading that you could offer to me in the Q&A that follows the panel. If you'll be willing to share that with Courtney Hoffman or Doreen Diop, I would greatly, greatly appreciate it. So as the daughter of British Romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Sara Coleridge has long received scholarly notice for her connection to the British Lake poets. Raised in the same home with her uncle and later poet laureate Robert Southey, Sara received a remarkable education as her translation of Martin Dobrizhoffer's An Account of the Epiphanies, written under his tutelage, testifies. In addition to literary and religious interests, Coleridge read widely on topics of medicine, and she chronicled her own episodes of headaches, eye complaints, and the matrix of physical and mental symptoms that she would variously regard as nervousness, nervous derangement, moral insanity, and hysteria this is in her personal writing. A diarist and poet in her own right, Coleridge's writing on the materially taxing experiences of breastfeeding and infant care provide a case study of British women writers' responses to medical texts that normalize physical care of infants as the primary mode for mothers to bond with their children. Coleridge's writing about illness, it connects with her literary output as well. Scholars of the last 2 decades, including Alan Vardy, Peter Schwab, and Donnell Roux, have begun to consider illness and disability as significant literary themes in her poetry and her fantasy novel, Phantasmian. And my own interest in the connections between her experiences of illness and her poetics has led me to the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin, and I will be drawing from transcriptions of her unpublished diary of her children's early years and letters located there. So, in part of my research on Coleridge's response to popular 18th century British medical texts has already included William Cadogan's essay upon nursing and the management of children. An essay on his body of research was published last fall in Essays in Romanticism. So, if you want to check out my essay, you may, if you enjoy this, you may really be interested in what I have there. So I have now expanded this body of research to include Hugh Smith's Letters to Married Women and William Moss's essay on the management and nursing of children in the earlier periods of infancy. All 3 of these texts that I'm going to discuss today are exemplary of a specialized genre of medical manuals written by medical men for audiences that expressly included women readers. The hypothesis supported by my reading of these texts is that medical men's advice manuals regarding pregnancy and infant care normalize views about maternal relationships and responsibilities, including that of a mother's relationship with her children. So I want to show you several passages of text that exhibit commonalities of language between Coleridge's writing and that of these medical texts. I'm especially interested in the declarations that these medical men make in their writing about the domains of knowledge previously considered under women's authority. So my long-term goal is to establish recognized commonalities of language between medical discourse and women's writing that will help us to, gain deeper insight into what women were writing. I'm especially interested in Victorian British women writers such as Sara Coleridge, Charlotte Bronte, and George Eliot, because these women were known to have read medical texts, even texts that may not have been named extensively in their extensive correspondence or diaries, so like in those kinds of things. But further, their writing demonstrates a dialogue of sorts between women writers and medical men who are writing medical discourse, to their exclusion. So by examining similarities between the advice given by Cadogan, Moss, and Smith's medical texts, I aim to show commonalities. Hang on, I'm gonna pause that. Greatly apologize for that. So I'm going to kind of skip it down a little bit because I don't want to run out of time. So this all relates to some of the research that I've been doing on strategies of writing in Coleridge's diaries, letters, and poetry, something that I'm using a key term I've developed called resistive embodiment. And I use this term to foreground embodiment and acts of resistance to medical and patriarchal surveillance. So in my analysis of Coleridge's writing, it seems that she used it as a means of response to shifting attitudes about women's social authority as mothers and educators of their children. And as I continue to theorize resistive embodiment as a key term, I'm hoping that it can open new readings of Coleridge's work. I draw inspiration from the work of disability scholar Margaret Price in using this key term and her conceptualization of body-mind as a term that calls attention to the ever-present connections between minds and bodies, and how that's never like really, they're never really two separate entities. It's just something that has to do with our cultural conceptions of the body and the mind. So my research on Sara Coleridge's writing then really brings me back to like the push and the pull of social authority between women readers and medical writers, which was evidenced in 18th century men's advice manuals, and the need kind of for better understanding these commonalities. So in the remainder of the time that I have today, I want to sketch out two areas that I've identified of commonality between Cadogan, Moss, and Smith. And I'm going to do that in the context of looking at how Sara Coleridge supplied their advice, or potentially their advice, in raising her two young infants. So first, I want to do that. And then second, I'm going to turn and look at some of the ways that these three writers talk about infringing on the domain of women's knowledge. So that's probably what I'll be able to accomplish in this talk. I wanted to be able to include more about dry nursing, but I doubt that we'll be able to get to that. So we'll see. Coleridge's diary of her children's early years provides important insights into a woman writer's frustrated attempts to match the social pressures inherent to motherhood in the late Romantic and early Victorian period. Her diary chronicles nearly 8 years of her married life, from the birth of her first child, Herbert, on the 7th of October, 1830, until the 28th of July, 1838, which is about a year after her move from Hampstead to Regent's Park. Initially, the diary opens as expected for a baby diary with the birth of her first child, a son that she affectionately calls Herbie. She dutifully commits to paper the details of his appearance, his weight, how often he breastfeeds, and other habits such as bowel management, and his walks outside. And as you can follow me on the handout, one of her earliest chronicles of Herbert as an infant, she kind of initially seems to take some pride in her application of this advice. So she says that Herbert, he was taking out a walking sometime before Christmas on fine days and seemed to enjoy the air. He generally sleeps from 11 or 12 at night, till 7 or 8 in the morning and seldom requires feeding in the night. So she seems to be taking some pride to this, but in examining these three medical texts, I find that she seems to be complying to recommendations of medical men. For example, Cadogan, he touts that an infant has a warmer body temperature and less tolerance of heat, that they actually tolerate the cold better. Cadogan says, quote, would therefore bear the cold of a winter's night much better than any adult person. So she seems to be mentioning that he's taken out in the cold air, that he seems to do well with it. And then in this passage of her diary, she also says of Kirby that she's doing the scheduled feeding, right? So she's noting his kind of feeding habits, his sleeping habits, and his walks outside with the nurse. Well, I noticed that she was giving very specific times for when he was feeding and that he wasn't feeding at night. And one of the things I noticed as I was looking at these medical manuals is that they recommend very scheduled feedings, not overfeeding babies, and not feeding them during the night. So that, I think we can start thinking about her, that this is kind of a dialogue back, speaking back to her attempts to comply with the advice in these medical manuals. So this isn't going to last. So although she finds some moderate success during Herbert's infancy, by 11 weeks, she starts recording that she is using alcohol to help her. She says, I have never got strong since my confinement. I know not whether nursing keeps me down, and that she treats this by trying to build up her strength. She says, quote, that she imbibes, quote, a half pint of ale and a little gin and water at night, occasionally a glass of port wine, and sometimes a glass of hot beer. And she goes on to say this use of this medicinal use of alcohol, but it seems to be in direct contradiction to medical men such as Cadogan, who warn against using alcohol while breastfeeding, that it could injure the baby. So by the time of her second child, who is Edith, by the time that she's born, Coleridge begins to chart the course of her own symptoms much more than her children's growth and behaviors. So here we have the second quote I'm sharing on September 12th. She says, my nervous debility and other unpleasant symptoms have increased so much that I was obliged to thinking seriously of feeding my darling, and she now takes milk and water. She was frightened by the spoon and at first with some repugnance to the bottle, but she now takes it very well in general. I now only nurse 5 times a day and must make it for the reduction, as I am and miserably nervous and flustered, partly owing to the atmosphere. I'm taking mineral tonics. Edith quarreled with the bottle this afternoon, but nurse will make some alterations in the nipple, which will make it more comfortable. So here we have her kind of going against the severity of medical men's advice, which they warned that dry nursing, which is feeding with a spoon or with a bottle, could be lethal, that infant mortality greatly increases with dry nursing. And yet she is so miserable breastfeeding that she has decided to go against that advice. And she is looking at that as an option now. So I think that's really interesting. The switch from a focus on infants to a focus on our own well-being may appear to 21st century readers as a deviation from the expected conventions of a baby diary. Other scholars have observed this as well. And I think that it could mean that there's a shift that's occurred in Coleridge's opinion of medical men's advice manuals on infant care because of how arduous this experience has been for her. But I'm not saying that she's just going to reject the advice of all physicians, surgeons, apothecaries. Rather, she's learning to temper their advice with her own reasoning, right? She's critically thinking on her own and feeling that she has a right to do so. So I want to skip down here next to the second section, which is looking at that similar approach between these three texts to the infringement of women's authority on matters of maternity and infant care. So we have William Cadigan, who says, quote, "In my opinion, this business has been too long fatally left to the management of women who cannot be supposed to have proper knowledge to fit them for such a task, notwithstanding they look upon it to be their own province." So what we Okay, and so this is in his kind of the introduction to his essay, an essay upon nursing. And then we have something very similar happening with William Moss, who wrote an essay on the management and nursing of children in the earlier periods of infancy, where he is kind of disparaging women thinking that they know, and nurses thinking that they know more about women, what women need and what their infants need. To quote him, he says, "And that is the entire direction which nurses assume in whichever concerns the management of lying in women and children, for they are so jealous and tenacious of what they suppose their authority upon these occasions, as seldom to suffer themselves to be directed or advised, any advice themselves to be directed or advised, any advice therefore given them and consider as a reflection upon their judgment and vindication of which they commonly rejected. By such conduct, the avenues to improvement are nearly shut." So he is here critiquing that nurses, feel some sense of that they have an authority in these matters. And then in Hugh Smith, he mentions that this sense of that he tries to reframe it as something that's older or outdated practices. He says that and as I mean to persuade rather than find fault, it is to be wished that the younger part of the female sex at least, whom it more nearly concerns, will not conceive this. Yeah, I'm in an airport, so I do apologize for that interruption. So so yes, in this third part, he says that he's hoping that the younger women will be more receptive to his ideas because he feels that he will meet with unconquerable prejudices from their experienced grand dames, he says. So what I wanted to say is that all three of these medical texts share the commonality of denigrating women's authority over breastfeeding and infant care, and by emphasizing physical contact as central to bonding between mothers and children, these three medical advice manuals on infant care potentially played a significant role in shifting cultural perspectives on the proper domestic activities of middle and upper class women. So unfortunately, I will not have time to discuss Coleridge's decision to dry nurse her second child at length. However, I have included that quote that I just read for you, and there's some really good parts to that, like thinking about that she is deciding that she's going to dry nurse, and then later she shares with her husband in a letter that her friend Fanny is also dry nursing. And so then she's like looking to other women. We're seeing this moment where she's looking to other women and their knowledge. I think that's very interesting. So Sara Coleridge's engagements and frustrations with medical advice provide an important motivation for her own efforts to explore alternative methods for ill mothers to fulfill maternal expectations, for promoting healthy child development and maternal infant bonding. For Coleridge, illness experiences offer firsthand instruction and insights that reorder her perspectives on motherhood. Moreover, they reinforce her own authority as an ill mother in ways that interrogate the reliability of medical men who write about women's bodies and maternal-child relationships. And thank you very much for listening to my talk today. And I do please ask that if you have any suggestions or ideas or directions for my further research, I'd be more than happy to receive those. Even as well as if you see like something that I need to think more deeply about, I'd also welcome those kinds of questions or comments. Thank you very much.